Thank you, everyone, for coming this morning. My name is Lynn Piławarczyk. I'd like to introduce Megan Bertol, Chris Riley, and Jose Quiroga in the audience. And also, if members of the NCTTP from the United States could just raise your hand, if you wouldn't mind, because people may come and ask you questions about your own experience. So thank you so much. Okay, so who are we? Basically, we're a collective of 36 programs in the United States serving torture survivors and their families, both medical-related services, psychological, social, and also legal. Our mission is to advance the knowledge, technical capacities, and resources devoted to the care of torture survivors living in the United States, and then to act collectively to hopefully prevent torture worldwide. Of course, our goal would be that we didn't exist, right? But this is our status at this time. So we know torture is practiced across the world. In our own research of 125 countries, which you'll hear a little bit later, 87% had signed the Convention Against Torture. So signing and ratifying has little substance at this particular time. In the United States, there's always that question of, well, how many torture survivors are there among us? And that's a big question, particularly as it applies to asylum seekers. Work done by CVT has suggested that about 44% of refugees coming into the United States are survivors of torture. There's been that data, the BACA data, that talked about between 5 and 35% of refugees are also survivors of torture. And why is it important? It's important for us to be able to describe this population because it really, in the end, is a public health problem. Violence is a public health problem. Torture is a public health problem. We need to be in the position to advocate and to improve the services, as our colleague from Australia has just stated. Without data, it's really impossible for even like-minded allies within policy positions to be able to work and help us reach our goals, and to look at who are we helping, what aspects of the work that we do are most helpful, and then begin to collect the outcome-related data that we're all searching for, that the field demands and that our funders demand. So in the United States, we've been fortunate enough to use data for purposes of advocacy. So if you're coming from various countries, I would just suggest, if there are more than one program within your country, to begin to work together. It's really important to be able to, as a unified body, be able to work and collect, and as you'll see this morning, the power that it can have. Part of our data was used actually in putting together a shadow report in Geneva when the periodic review of the United States was before us. So there are potential implications, but I do want to state, though, that we always have, it's a tension also, because we need to be careful not to purely objectify the people that we work with. And as in all clinical research, it needs to be grounded with the goal of improving the quality of the lives of the people that we work with. It's not about numbers. It's about improving the quality of life. Across programs, people have used this data individually and within their states to be able to help for funding purposes, because we're all facing, as we've heard many, many times since we've arrived here in Mexico City, about the pie is getting smaller. So we need to be smart and we need to be strategic. And part of that involves public education. The use of the information that we can gather can be within that realm, particularly as the media increasingly personifies torture in a 30-minute slot. I mean, this is what the American public is being exposed to, and I'm sure within your own countries. So it's really important. And finally, we need to use the data to do the work, and to do the work better. So let me pass the baton now to Chris Riley. We have a little traveling show here, so. Here we go. This is to advance it. Just press.
Okay. Like going out on a, I don't know what, a gangplank or something. Probably not quite that. What? Okay.
We're so glad to be here. It's wonderful to be here with you all, and it's wonderful to see so many people here with interest in data, and it's fun to hear about it, and we'd love to talk about it further with you all and hear what you're doing. We thought about in the NCTTP collecting data for a very long time before we did it. I think it was close, well, at least 8 years before we started collecting data. We thought about it. How do we do it? What do we do? We tried it. One of the things that is true in the United States is that we have what's called the institutional review boards, and that's something that oversees research with human beings, human subjects, to make sure that it is okay. This started after the horrors of the Second World War and so on. So one of the things that we decided to do was to go through the institutional review board. My institutional review board said they would do it, so that's why I'm here. And I'm glad I'm here. But one of the things is that it involved a lot, and we wrote a data use agreement together. We have, and the data use agreement took about a year to do. We had a lot of revisions, a lot of phone calls, a lot of emails. The thing that's a part of the IRB, we have a promise to take care of the data. The main thing about it is data safety. Don't leave the data laying around. Keep it safe. Don't lose it. Take precautions not to lose it, and so on. We developed several things that go with the IRB. We also had to develop the process that we were going to use to have people submit the data. One of the things that we have done is have safe data transfer and storage, an Excel file that people put things in, drop-down menus, and so on. So it took a lot of time, and it also, I think the process was good for the outcome because it involved a lot of people and got a lot of buy-in from the people involved. We have added data each year. For example, we started with 10 basic data points, and also some of these 10 were what we call registration data points. We devised a process of what we call a random number client ID. On our data is no identifiers of who the person is, or even when it gets into the final form, where the data comes from. So we're taking very, very high precautions. And if anyone wants to know more about that, I'd be glad to talk about that. The variables are in one of the things that we started doing is collecting data that are a national funder that funds many of the centers in the NCTTP for their torture treatment. They required of the centers, for the centers to submit data in aggregate form. So we thought if they're going to have to do it for the federal funder in aggregate form, we can do it in client level form. And so that's one of the things that we did. We then kept adding things like employment status and in current employment status each year, that for housing, also psychiatric and physical diagnosis. This is harder to collect, but we think it's very, very important, and we're encouraging and figuring out ways that each of our centers can do that. Perception of one's own physical health is an important variable. It's been known to say a lot about how a person's doing. But then we also wanted to collect the diagnosis. Then we also collected access to basic resources and community involvement. These are both at intake and the current year. So we have several outcome variables that we are working on continually. Okay, next slide is right here. Just a little note about the individual level data versus aggregate data. The if you have individual level data, it's much, much stronger, as you know, if you've worked with data, because you can show interactions of data. You can sort out the men, you can sort out the gender, you can sort out by age, you can sort out by types of torture, and then see how they're doing in outcomes. So that's one of the main reasons that we know the value of the individual data. This is also, I think, one thing that makes the data useful, very useful for each center, because they have to collect this data already, and so they're pleased to give it to us in individual level data, and then we can work together on what data to collect and so on. And one of the best things for this is that the higher numbers that we're able to accumulate with the collecting from all the centers, 26 centers right now, makes what we can say, our message, powerful. The thing, I think these are some of the things that have made it work. I think the Institutional Review Board, data safety is very important, collaboration among centers, a data use agreement. One of the things that we decided when we were writing our data use agreement is that anything that we publish will be published not by the main author, not by a particular center, but it's published by the member centers that participated in submitting data. So all our papers that we've had one published so far, now is published, the authors is the member centers of the National Consortium of Torture Treatment Programs. This feels very good. It feels very good to all of us. It especially feels good to the centers and to maybe a center that hasn't ever published before. Building enthusiasm, we have monthly calls, we make decisions about data, we review materials. We also work with our committees, like we have an advocacy committee, and that informs some of what we are planning to collect. This is our paper that was published in the Torture Journal almost to the day 1 year ago. So we are very pleased. If you haven't read this, please look at it. And the findings from the paper is that of 9,025 torture survivors represented, most came from Africa or Asia and reported an average of 3.5 types of torture. We found that asylum seekers have different immigration experiences and show significantly higher rates of major depressive disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder than refugees. Also, torture survivors at high risk of PTSD and major depressive disorder in our sample reported 3 or more types of torture, reported rape, and had an immigration status of asylum seeker. At 1 and 2 years after beginning treatment, both asylum seekers and refugees reported increased rates of employment and improvements in their immigration status. Again, we can talk more later. And Megan, please help us continue.
Thank you. Do I have the clicker? Great. I discovered something recently. I'm getting older. I don't know if that's true for any of you, but part of what that means, I'm going to be doing a walkthrough of some of our data, just a snapshot of some of our data. So my eyesight isn't quite as good as it used to be, so I'm going to come a little closer. I think perhaps that if I move here, I hope I won't interfere with any of your vision. Okay, so this, the data that I'll be presenting is data that we reported in the Torture Journal article that Chris just mentioned. And so if you're interested, you can find out a lot more about this. These are the top 10 countries of origin for the clients for whom we have data from fiscal years 2008 to fiscal years 2013, the time period covered in that article. Let's see, does this, oh, sorry. There's not a green thing. Anyway, the top countries were Ethiopia, Iraq, Somalia, Bosnia, Cameroon, Uganda, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Eritrea, Cambodia, and Iran.
And this represented, from these 10 countries, represented 56% of all the clients in this database. As Chris mentioned, the majority of the clients represented in this database come from different countries in Africa, 52%. The next group came from various countries in Asia, about 1/3 of the data set, 6% from the Americas, 9% from Europe, and 2% from the Pacific Islands. Here's a snapshot of some of the demographic characteristics represented in the sample. A little more than half were male. 53% were married. The average age at intake was 40 years old, although that ranged from very young children up to 80 plus. And the reason we say 80 plus here was a further attempt to safeguard the identities of individuals in our data set. For example, if there were some elderly survivors represented in the data set, perhaps there weren't too many from their particular country, we thought it might be easier to identify a given individual. The average number of years of formal education in the homeland was almost 12 years. And 48% of the survivors in this data set reported that they were Christian, 38.5% Muslim, and 13.5% identified as affiliating with another religion. We heard about, from the Australian group, I think you said something like 13% of the survivors, something like that you served were children. In our data set, 7% were children at intake. You can see that the majority were aged 25 or older at the time of intake, with the most heavily represented age group being from 25 to 44. The majority, 51%, so just over half, at the time of intake were seeking asylum. 5% already had obtained asylum status and were asylees at the time of intake. 27% were refugees. 6% were lawful permanent residents, a step on the pathway towards citizenship in the United States. 3% were U.S. citizens, and 8% had another form of legal status at the time of intake. This is a snapshot of the types of torture experienced over fiscal years 2010 to 2013. However, it's important to note that most of the survivors that we serve across the consortium in the United States have experienced multiple types of torture. So the most heavily reported types of torture were beatings and threats, followed by witnessing, deprivation. About a third reported those experiences. Sensory deprivation, humiliation, about 19% reported rape. We believe that this, and maybe some of the other categories, is really an underreporting. This was reported, well, we'll see that in a minute. Kidnapping, wounding, forced positions, I believe this one is, and other types. We did a look at whether there were gender differences across these types of torture. You'll see that for the threats and the humiliation, there were not significant differences, gender differences. However, for all of the other categories, there were. For example, most of them were significantly more reported by males, with the exception of rape, which was reported more frequently by females in our sample. In terms of age at first torture, nearly a quarter were children at the time that they were first tortured. And I think it's important to emphasize this word first. I would imagine that this would be true for many of you in the programs that you work in, because many of the survivors that we serve across the United States have been tortured on multiple occasions. So about a quarter were first tortured when they were children. but the majority were first tortured when they were aged 25 or older. It's important to note, although this is a very small percentage, half of 1%, that some of the survivors we serve, I'll be interested to hear if that's true for you, were over the age of 65 at the time of their first torture. In terms of post-traumatic stress disorder and depression, indeed we found high levels of co-occurring PTSD and depression in this population. I'll show you in a minute how this broke down from asylum seekers and refugees. But 69% reported PTSD either alone or in combination with another clinical psychiatric condition. 30% had PTSD only. A little over half had depression, either alone or in combination with another psychiatric condition. 32% had both PTSD and depression, and so on. If you take a look here, we broke this down in terms of those who were asylum seekers at the time of intake versus those who were refugees. And there were high rates of all of these conditions for both groups. However, we did find that the asylum seekers had a significantly greater percentage of any post-traumatic stress disorder compared to the refugee population. This also was true when it came to major depressive disorder, either alone or in combination, and also true for co-occurring PTSD and major depression. In terms of health consequences, as a consortium in the US, we've become increasingly interested and started to document physical health conditions in the survivors that we serve. We recognize that, as I've heard throughout the symposium this week, that the consequences of torture are multifaceted. They aren't confined to one realm of a person's experience often. They encompass physical, psychological, and social dimensions. And so we also are aware of a lot of the literature that has shown that hypertension and diabetes are also commonly associated with trauma, with stress, and with PTSD. So as we move forward as a consortium, our current thinking, and this gets informed through all of our monthly calls and with input from all of our participating centers, which is lovely to see a number of them represented here in the room today, is that we have our next paper in progress already, looking more at some of the outcomes that we've been tracking over the last few years, including not just clinical outcomes, but functional outcomes in terms of housing, in terms of employment. We are also looking, we have some initial data on the rates of type 2 diabetes and hypertension among the survivors that we serve. And amongst the member centers of the National Consortium of Torture Treatment Programs in the United States, over the last 2 years, there's been an increased commitment to participate in our shared data project. I think maybe that this may go back to what Lynn was speaking about in terms of the various uses that member centers and the consortium as a whole has found that the data can contribute to. And we are, as I believe Chris mentioned, increasingly collaborating with our policy advocacy subcommittee to our future plans, no doubt, will include adding some additional data points that we can collect across the consortium that can have keen, practical policy implications to support us across our country in doing that very important advocacy, which seems more important than ever at this time in our history. For fiscal year 2016, we are receiving data as we speak. And we anticipate having data on 15,000 survivors seen across, I believe it's 26 centers in our consortium. We plan for the future to, as I mentioned, document not just the health problems, but with particular attention to chronic health conditions. We have plans to begin to collect data over time, prospective data, particularly for diabetes and hypertension, two conditions that are quite prevalent among the survivors that we serve. We also are well aware of the fact that many of the survivors we serve, probably true for many of the survivors you serve, have experienced head trauma, some rising to the level of experiencing traumatic brain injuries. What we found is that, and this is well documented in the literature, is that the kinds of interventions and treatment that can be effective or have more of a chance of being effective, they need to be different, right, than standard treatment perhaps for PTSD, for depression, for other conditions. And we believe, as a national consortium in the US, that there is a lot of undetected and hence unaddressed, untreated head trauma and traumatic brain injury. And consortium members, several consortium members have been doing some research in this area. We also plan to attend more to dementia. We are finding that that there are a number of the survivors that we serve who have signs of dementia, maybe early onset or for some more advanced. And it appears that this may be happening, I know for some of the Cambodians who I've worked with extensively, at younger ages on average than we might see in the US general population in our country. We also plan to continue the work and deepen our work as a consortium at looking at some of the treatment outcomes. Chris has mentioned some of them, but we also want to look more closely at quality of life, and not just the symptoms, but also the functioning across multiple domains. And most importantly, we want to share with you that these data that we just talked about and shared with you and the consortium published in the Torture Journal belong to the participating centers of the National Consortium of Torture Treatment Programs in the United States as part of the consortium's research and data project. And finally, before maybe my colleagues might want to say something, we want to thank the Oregon Health and Science University, their team, their staff at the Torture Treatment Center there, who have donated Chris to us to lead the coordination of our effort, but also for OHSU's IRB that is serving as the IRB of record for all of the participating centers in our project. Certainly some of the individual participating centers have their own IRBs, but OHSU's IRB has developed cooperative agreements with those IRBs, and without this, we could not do this work. So thank you to OHSU. Do any of my colleagues want to add? Do we have time for any? No. Okay. Well, we look forward to discussion and questions later on. Thank you.